So what I'm going to try and do in the next few slides really is talk about how the two are interlinked, what role climate change is playing in the loss of biodiversity, and then focus a little bit on some examples from Ireland and maybe look a little bit as well about where we might have some knowledge gaps. So it's a classic sort of a scientific response to a question like this. What role is climate change playing in biodiversity loss? Well, we have a complex system, the climate system. Biodiversity is obviously complex in its interactions with ecosystem functioning as well. So it's very difficult to partition the exact role climate is playing. For some species, and there are specifics, but oftentimes it's difficult to do this. That's quite a challenge for science. I think it's improving the more observations we make and the more we try and link these two things. What we can say with some more certainty is that in general, where we have greater levels of global warming, we can expect greater impacts on biodiversity. So that's fairly clear. The science is quite strong on that point. So difficult to pinpoint specifics often for ecosystems, but at the bigger picture, it's clear we need to limit warming well below 2 degrees Celsius to minimize those impacts. This rate of change is also critical. So there's very little time for our natural systems to adapt, never mind evolve, for species to evolve, because this rate of change is so rapid. That's particularly problematic, so anything we can do to slow down that rate of change as well is going to give some more breathing space to those systems. The other thing to think about, I suppose, is ecosystem functioning. So not just the species in the ecosystems, but how they're cycling nutrients and carbon and storing water. So these things are all connected as well into this. So I suppose it's bigger than just biodiversity as such. It's also the functioning of these ecosystems. And I mentioned yet another report, but this one was released just this year, and this is the Working Group 2 IPCC report. And this particular work looks at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So you'll find a lot more in here on biodiversity. So I think, again, it's a useful resource if you're interested in more detail. A few high-level messages from this. If we exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming for even a few decades, there will be irreversible effects on biodiversity and ecosystems. So obviously where we have extinctions, where we have the loss of ecosystems or habitats that don't exist anywhere else, very difficult, impossible in some cases to restore that, unfortunately. So again, that's why we need that urgency on climate to try and minimize the impacts on biodiversity at a global level. There's a few ways in this report in which they looked at these impacts, so changes in ecosystem structure, so maybe some species becoming more dominant over others that previously were not, or some species disappearing completely. Changes in range, so there may be areas where species thrived previously, but under current and future climate conditions, that won't be the case, so they'll either have to move or they'll disappear. And then we have changes in phenology, so the timing or seasonality. In Europe, one of the analyses in this report looks at the regions and these three sort of categories, and in Europe, all three have been observed for freshwater, marine, and terrestrial ecosystems. And I suspect they'd probably be observed for all the other regions in the world as well, but there may be data gaps there, so we have sort of more data collected in Europe essentially. So I suspect that might be one of the reasons. But again, the key message here is that this is happening now. These impacts have been observed already. It's not a future scenario. At this point, talking about the impact of climate change and biodiversity, I think it's important to stop for a moment and just say that in the big picture, land management and natural resource use by far has a greater negative impact. Unsustainable land use, I should say, and resource use has a much greater impact on biodiversity than climate at the moment. Obviously, climate is having an impact, but when we look for the climate signal, it's quite small compared to the land management and resource use. So this particular figure comes from the IPCC land report that I was lucky to be involved with, and one of the things we looked at in that report were changes in how we use land in terms of intensity. So that particular figure, you can see line number 1 there is an increase in global nitrogen fertilizer use, about 800% increase since 1961. So that level of change, again, another unprecedented change, anthropogenic. Also increasing, we have In a positive, cereal yields have increased in that time, which is positive, but to get that increase does require more inputs as well. We have greater numbers of livestock and more water being used for agriculture. Now, this is just one particular focus here on land, but you could also look at the oceans and how resources are managed there as well. So all this has placed additional stress on ecosystem functioning and driven biodiversity loss. This report as well found, the land report I should say, found that climate change is adding further pressure to this. So we'd expect that signal for climate impact to increase. So looking closer to home now for a moment, trying to zoom down. Again, we don't have a massive wealth of information on climate impacts on ecosystems in Ireland. I know there's lots of projects underway at the moment that will improve that picture, hopefully in the next couple of years. But a really important piece of work is the NPWS Habitats Directive report. So climate change is now recognised as a threat for several habitats, including sea cliffs, wet heath, alpine and subalpine heath and raised bogs. Again, we'd expect the number of habitats impacted to increase in the future, unfortunately. These are particularly vulnerable because they're going to be affected by changes in precipitation patterns, sea level rise, and obviously all ecosystems are going to be affected by temperature change, but they're particularly vulnerable. Already, obviously, vulnerable habitats if they're protected. A nice visual of how this looks in the bigger picture of threats and pressures, again from the NPWS report, you'll see climate change is one of the smaller threats and pressures in the overall scheme of things. Again, agriculture, forestry, alien and invasive species, much higher in terms of the number of habitats they're impacting. I suppose one thing I would say about this, and this is just sort of, it's a hypothesis more than anything, I'd suspect if we looked at the interlinkages between climate change and other pressures, we'd find it's playing a much larger role, but I don't think we have the data to back that up at the moment. So for example, problematic and alien invasive species, we know there's research to tell us that that's expected to increase as climate change increases. So there's a threat multiplier effect happening as well. So I think it's quite difficult to address, but I suspect climate change is probably playing a larger role in some of these than we're aware of at the moment. Moving away from habitats, looking more at species, and again, this mirrors the global pattern. The species which are going to be most at risk from climate change, those that already have limited distributions. So if they're already limited, any change in their conditions could have a negative impact. If they're close to their physiological niche in terms of climate, so if a large change in temperature or seasonality, that could push that particular species over the edge. Also, those that have a limited ability to disperse or re-establish, they're going to be particularly vulnerable as well. And I think a lot of the time, and I'm biased because I come from a plant science and plant ecology focus, but I think plants are often overlooked, and they're particularly at risk because it takes much longer for species to naturally migrate if they're plants than animals. So again, if those seasons are shifting, and we know they are, if we're having those changes in precipitation patterns and the other factors mentioned, again, this is going to impact those species that can't keep up with this rate of change. A few other things that emerge, and this list is not exhaustive, but invasive species in particular, this comes up in a lot of the international literature, and there's some emerging evidence, I think, in Ireland as well. Not looking just at plants, but also at freshwater systems. We're likely to see the emergence of more of these, and they may become more competitive under future climate. So this is something I think we need to be sort of aware of and monitoring, because it's much better if we can stop the invasive species becoming established once they sort of become invasive. So we want to avoid that happening. So I think there's a piece of work to be done there, an ongoing monitoring of that. And then there's pests and disease as well. Again, we expect there's going to be novel pest and disease outbreaks. So there's probably a role to play there for the control, if you think about things like ash dieback, so that how such pests enter the country. There are things we can do, and we probably need to increase that effort in the face of climate change as well. So the other thing to mention then is biodiversity loss and how it can feed back to the climate system as well. So I focus more on the impacts here, but obviously I could have talked a lot more about this, so I just tried to limit it to one slide. Essentially, if we have a reduction in productivity, this is really at the basic level, due to climate change, due to biodiversity loss in this instance. So if we have a loss of species or ecosystem functioning that reduces that productivity, that's going to reduce the amount of carbon we're taking in to that ecosystem, and then that's going to feed back to the climate system as well. So that one's relatively straightforward, I think. More complex is that where we have ecosystems that are losing species and they're becoming more simple, they're likely to be less stable. So we know that if there's more ecosystem complexity, it adds stability to ecosystems. So that's a problem because it makes those systems that have lost key species more vulnerable to shocks, such as climate shocks. And then there's the case of specific species that play a really important role in particular ecosystems. I've just taken the example here of if we think of sphagnum mosses in a peatland system, if the climate system changes, such as those species are no longer able to thrive, then that will reduce the capacity of the whole peatland to function and sequester carbon. So again, this feeds back to the climate system. I suppose in a nutshell, a degraded ecosystem is likely to have a reduced capacity to store carbon in soils and biomass as well, probably, in most cases. So that sort of sustainable land management, biodiversity piece coming together to support climate, I think is really important. So for the final couple of slides, I just want to look a little bit towards more the policy sphere, I suppose, some of the challenges of addressing these intertwined, interconnected challenges. So the first thing, again, this draws on the land report that I mentioned already. If we're trying to achieve net zero, and it's often regarded as a sort of a minimum for the land system globally to contribute to climate mitigation is to become net zero. What does that mean in terms of emission reductions? One of the things that's important that this report pointed out is that you can't expect the land system to soak up all the carbon from fossil fuels in other sectors. It just is not feasible, it's not possible. So we do need all sectors to contribute globally to achieve, limit global warming essentially. And the reason the land system can only play a certain part in mitigation is because we expect so many other services from land. So the ecosystem services, food production, fibre production, the list goes on. So we can't just expect to sort of use the land system to get our way out of climate change, essentially. In Ireland, we have our own challenges. So we have a lot of emissions from agriculture. We also have a lot of emissions from the land itself. And we know that if we want to get to net zero, so we're going to have to see significant changes in the landscape. So restoration of degraded or exploited peatlands, organic soils that are used for other purposes, and large-scale afforestation. So I haven't put numbers on here because there's a piece of work ongoing at the minute that I'm involved with on this. But to get to net zero, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of hectares of forestry, for example, to get to that. So that level of change poses really large challenges, I think, for how we ensure biodiversity is not lost in all of this change. So I wanted to have a positive slide here because it's quite easy to be completely negative talking about climate, but there's a lot of potential for positive synergies between actions as well. I think this is important. So if we restore our peatlands, this should be a win-win for biodiversity and climate change. Afforestation, where it's managed sustainably, so we're talking about things like moving towards continuous cover forestry, more sustainable management practices. If it's targeted at the right areas, i.e. those that don't have high levels of biodiversity at the moment, such as our extensively managed grasslands in much of the country, and soils as well. So we know this from the past, we can't continue to afforest on peat. But if we do those things, we can get some win-wins for biodiversity as well. It is possible, I think. It's not beyond what we can do. You know, it is possible. That doesn't say it's easy. In the agricultural systems, things like more diverse farming methods such as agroforestry and organics, I think they have a role to play. And this list is not exhaustive again. It's just pulling a few that came to the fore, really. That will improve adaptation to shocks, including economic shocks, such as the ones we've experienced this year, so more diverse agricultural systems. And that should also then give more space for nature as well. So potentially there are win-wins there. And nature-based solutions, I haven't mentioned those a lot, but there's real potential to integrate those into our infrastructure design and so on to enhance both climate adaptation and biodiversity. So there's a lot of potential for positives. On the negative side, and again, this list is not exhaustive, I focused in on afforestation and bioenergy because these were particularly called out, I suppose, in the IPCC land report. So if these are deployed at large scale, particularly where they're monocultures, we know there are specific risks to biodiversity. So this is not, I suppose, not new. But how we avoid that is really important in terms of planning. It's not going to be easy. I think we need some sort of a move towards more integrated planning of our land use. I suppose one ray of hope here is that this is not unique to Ireland. I think in the national discourse, sometimes it can be very, we feel like we're the only ones dealing with these problems, but all around the world, countries are dealing with similar issues, trying to meet their climate commitments, at the same time not destroy biodiversity. So I think we can learn from international experiences as well, and maybe those collaborations, it might be a little bit easier to have those conversations sometimes with someone looking from the outside in, perhaps, with a new perspective. So the final slide, I'm a bit conscious of time. So obviously these are interlinked in a complex manner. Many of the solutions, therefore, are not going to be simple. Climate actions, especially those which are nature-based, I focused on the land-based ones here, they need to take biodiversity conservation and ecosystem integrity into account. And I think that needs to be done in some sort of more explicit way. Otherwise, there is a significant potential for unintended negative impacts, unfortunately. It's also important to be realistic. Not all the things we do for climate, not all the things we do for biodiversity are going to be synergistic. There will be cases where we have to prioritize. It might be a particular habitat, for example. It may not have a climate positive benefit by restoring it. I think we have to face up to that and prioritize, and it's going to be difficult to do so, but that's the challenges we're going to have to deal with. And then the final point again, we need some sort of integrated planning to achieve these things, and I don't have the answer for that, unfortunately. I think it's going to be quite a challenge for the next few years, really. But there's always hope that we can improve, for sure. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eamon. Now we have some time for questions. So I'll take one from the floor. I think there is a roving microphone if you want to put up your hand. And we'll take one, and then we might take one online as well. So Eamon, if you're happy to stay there, we'll have our first question, please. Maybe if you just tell us who you are and who you represent, and then make your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Tygo Mahoney, Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you for that. It's a very useful overview of the interlinkages, and I think seeing the interlinkages, but also seeing the emergencies that we have both in terms of climate and biodiversity, and also the fact that we have a Department of Climate, of Environment, Climate and Communications. Is it now timely to consider the formation of a separate ministry for nature and biodiversity? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure that question, I'm the best placed to answer that question, but I think what I do know is we need more integrated approaches. So if that was to achieve that, I'm not sure if it would, but if it did, that would be positive. So I don't really have a direct answer. No, Gerry, if you want to comment on that. It's not, I suppose, if it were to achieve the integrated planning we need, then I'd be all for it, I suppose. But whether or not that's the case, I can't say.
I mean, thanks for that contribution. I mean, I think it's really clear from your own agency's report in 2020, where you looked at your key recommendation there, I think, is that environment policy at national level needs to be more integrated. And I think that for sure is clear. And whatever mechanisms the government chooses to achieve that, I think, is really for the government to decide. But for sure we need to integrate things. you know, this morning we've heard from Eamon the really intimate connections between biodiversity and climate change. We know that there are also linkages with the water system, with marine policy. So there are lots of linkages around. In any government system, unfortunately, we have the problems of, you know, not everything being integrated, but that's the nature of government, and that's a challenge for all of us in that system. Okay, I think we'll take one more contribution and then we'll move on with the rest of the session. Yes, we have somebody there. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mary Gerry here from the Environmental Protection Agency. Just back to the integration, I suppose, piece again. I think it's really important that water is included. It's great to see the discussion on climate and biodiversity linkages, but absolutely essential, I think, that water is included in that, given the pressures are so consistent: agriculture, forestry, peatland, the solutions, nature-based solutions, and the types of measures. And there's huge opportunity for multiple benefits, and you know, the future work that will be going on in terms of measures with farmers and land to get the biodiversity, water quality and climate wins out of someone. Now they don't, and also to prevent, as you mentioned, you know, unintended consequences. So, you know, we have a climate action plan, we'll have a biodiversity action plan, a river basin management plan, and it's just, as an observation, really, really important that the three of them speak to each other, and that policymakers and practitioners, you know, are thinking all the time of what are the multiple benefits here for each of these areas that can be make the best use of our resources.
Yeah, and that came up yesterday, I think, very clearly in some of the sessions on forestry and agriculture as well, water quality and its role. Obviously, I focused on biodiversity and climate. When I'm talking about ecosystem functioning, water storage, water quality, that's all part of that as well. Of course, it's in there, but yeah, we certainly need to be explicit in how we include water as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we'll have another opportunity to take more questions at the end of the session, but I'm anxious that we get on now. So thank you, Eamon. Thanks for a very illuminating and instructive contribution. So now we have a series of four shorter presentations, and I'd ask the speakers to join me here for that, please. And the first speaker I want to introduce you to is Shirley Clerkin. So Shirley has 25 years experience working in the heritage and biodiversity sectors. She's the Heritage Officer with Monaghan County Council, having previously worked for the Irish Wildlife Trust and for An Taisce. Shirley coordinates biodiversity research, best practice, capacity building and conservation through the delivery of the County Monaghan Heritage and Biodiversity Strategic Plan. And she's also a steering group member and Uplands Work Package Lead for the Interreg project, the Collaborative Action for Natura Network project. And Shirley has also had an involvement with sustainable cultural tourism at a European level as part of the European Year of Cultural Heritage and its outcomes. And I'm delighted to ask Shirley now to make a presentation to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerry. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here today. I'm the Heritage Officer with Monaghan County Council, and there's the Heritage Officers in all of the local authorities right across Ireland at the moment, and we work both for heritage and biodiversity, so we cover both tangible, intangible, and the natural heritage. And how do I move this? Oh, there's a button. How to move the slides. So we work on 5-year, we work with the community and local authority and state agencies to develop biodiversity and heritage plans. And our most recent one in Monaghan is an integrated biodiversity and heritage strategic plan that really integrates climate adaptation and mitigation across all of its themes and all of its actions. And as heritage officers, we really try to change the local authority from within by recognising the interconnectivity of both environmental, social, cultural and economic issues and systems. And we try to work to find solutions and to find co-benefits of actions. So in our current plan, for example, we recognise Monaghan wetlands as being one of the most urgent areas for action, and we recognise in their continuing decline, despite all the work that we've been trying to do on them, and to try to acknowledge their role for climate, and to see really what we can do at that strategic county level for them, and building our evidence base to do more work. So I'm just going to go through really quickly. Oh, I keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. I should get the hang of this yet. So we cannot solve the climate crisis without the help of nature, and I think that's been very much acknowledged over the last day. And we're looking at both adaptation and mitigation. And initially, when local authorities were tasked with climate action plans, they were really told to focus on adaptation, and the mitigation part was left out, but that's been changed, thankfully. So now we are looking at mitigation. And from the point of view of the biodiversity and heritage plans, really what we're looking at are, efforts to reduce greenhouse gases from natural systems. What we can do to restore our degraded peatlands, for example, so that they're not emitting carbon when they should, of course, be acting as carbon sinks and performing carbon sequestration. And the wetland services that are at risk in a warmer Ireland are, of course, air quality. And we've had a number of fires, for example, on Slieve Bay over the last number of years. And they are tasked to become, Ireland is expected to have more hot days, more drought days, more days where we can have fires that will get out of control. So, for example, on Slieve Bay, we've often had fire services on both sides of the border putting out extensive wildfires, trying to beat them out over a number of days in really roaring heat. To try to protect those blanket bogs, which are degraded, so they're drier, so they're more able to, sort of take light. They've got more millennia grass on them because they're not being grazed properly. Therefore, there's a higher fuel load. So that then, coupled with hotter days, we're into that negative feedback loop, or those complex interrelations that Eamon was talking about. We're obviously at risk at losing pollination and food chains. Our insects are at the basis of all of our food chains, for example. So we're at risk of losing those in a warmer Ireland. Carbon sequestration and storage. So, for example, our peat-forming mosses and our wetlands. Wetlands are one of the ecosystem types that are most at risk of change in a changed environment from the point of view of a climatic perspective. And our beautiful sphagnum mosses, which we so depend on in our wetlands, what will happen if indeed they do not continue to grow at the rate that they're growing, laying down the peat, laying down those anaerobic conditions for which we depend on. Water quality, of course, I think it was well mentioned by the last speaker there, the need to consider water quality. And indeed, when we're looking at water quality in Monaghan, even 15 years ago when we looked at our wetlands initially, we found that the habitats which were most eutrophied had much less species in them. They were much poorer from their species index than the ones that were of good water quality. And so how are those ecosystems going to then be resilient in a time of climate change if they're already denuded of their species? And of course then our intrinsic value of our nature itself. And as I think Mary Robinson said it, that nature is really at risk. Nature is which we depend on. And that is an injustice to nature itself, the loss of nature, the loss of species, the loss of habitats, the right to life, the right for these habitats and species to thrive, to survive and thrive. 3 minutes. So this is the system we're in. We're in a volatile, uncertain, increasingly complex and ambiguous world. And that triple whammy that we have to deal with, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the pollution and the waste problem, are all interlinked, and we do need interlinking solutions. So this is the work we've been doing in Monaghan over the last number of years, from 2006, trying to collect an evidence base for the wetlands that we have in Monaghan. So now we have a wetlands map, an inventory of over 700 wetlands in the county. We know where they are. We've done, for example, a study looking at the wetland ecosystem services right back in 2010, where we looked at 6 different wetland sites. We evaluated them to see what their carbon sequestration value was, for example. And at that stage, the blanket bog in Slieve Bay was worth 50 million alone just for carbon. We've also produced we've done several conferences, but more recently, and we'll come to this, we're doing conservation, and we've established a wetland network, and we've established a wetland action plan. But why are bogs important? You know all of this. I'll just put these slides up. I'm not even going to go through it. But you can see they're very important for water, very important for carbon. They prevent flooding, all of these ecosystem services that we depend on. And of course, they need water. And they need it within 10 centimetres of the surface, and they grow very slowly as well. So they're slow-growing ecosystems that can provide stable services for us if their services are protected. Here's what Slieve Bay looks like in some areas. That's digging out with an excavator for peat, and that's the results of a fire. So recently with Interreg funding with our other partners in the north, we finally managed to get some conservation works done in Slieve Bay, and these have been very hard won. It's extremely difficult for procurement, it's extremely difficult for funding. The mechanisms to get permission are extremely arduous. Everything takes ages. But eventually, after 5 years of work, and maybe 3 or 4 years in the planning before that, we've managed to block 125 hectares of drains to keep the water in the bog, to prevent runoff, protect water quality. We removed Sitka spruce, self-seeded Sitka, and rhododendron, and we've done a huge wildfire management plan, both sides of the border, with the fire services and the nature conservation agencies across 12,000 hectares. And we've produced 2 conservation plans, which, you know, obviously 2 conservation plans for the one site, one for the north and one for the south. We've also done a County Monaghan Wetland Action Plan, and we looked for attitudes from our public, first of all, on how they interacted with wetlands. And you can see that people really wanted to be involved. They gained inspiration, so that cultural benefit from wetlands, and really wanted to work with us. We've done the RAWS, and we've done the first RAWS assessment of wetland services in the country using the Rapid Assessment of Wetland Ecosystem Services from the Ramsar Convention. We looked at 200 wetlands of our 700 on our database and looked at them from the provisioning services point of view, cultural, regulatory and supporting services, to see if we can score them easily for funders to understand if we say we want to do habitat works and bring up the provisioning services in that area, that we're raising the score for that habitat type. Or likewise, if we're trying to protect the carbon sequestration function, we're raising the supporting services score. Easy to score, easy to evaluate from a funder's point of view, and easy for the public to understand. And just my last slide, Gerry, you'll be pleased to know. I think that was a bit of a, hope I didn't talk too fast. Things that we think we really need to do. So we're hoping to develop restoration plans and actions over the next 3 years with landowners in County Monaghan to do more conservation works on more of our wetland sites, our smaller wetland sites in between the drumlins. And we've got funding for this through the National Parks and Wildlife Local Biodiversity Fund, and we'll be starting that very shortly. We want to continue to work with the County Monaghan Wetlands Network, which we've established, which is also difficult work, working with a wide range of stakeholders, gun clubs, for example, river trusts, landowners, you know, to try to build restoration actions for wetlands and build advocacy for them. We're doing funding application. We have it in with the Shared Island unit at the moment for a big peatlands project feasibility study. And then to scale up the lessons learned. We all need this evidence base, but we need action plans to be implemented and implementable, and a funding stream that's easily accessible. We need to secure and score landowners work for wetland ecosystem services on site. So we need an RBAP scheme essentially for the delivery of wetland ecosystem services in County Monaghan and much further afield across the whole country. Local based schemes involving local landowners. We need a public engagement scheme about the value of ecosystem services, and that's just a clip from one of the signs that we have to go out on our wetland sites showing the wetland services provided by wetlands in Monaghan. And we need to embed wetlands and climate action plans for mitigation and adaptation. And we really need to start re-wetting wetlands and peatlands at scale now. It's easy to do. The mechanisms for it are simple. We know how to do it. We know where the drains are. And it's really, if we wanted a quick win, I would certainly start with re-wetting as many peatlands as we could so that we build resilience into those ecosystems at the earliest possible date. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Shirley. It's really great to see work like that being undertaken by a local authority. It's wonderful to see the cross-border dimension, which I know on Taoiseach was very, brought us into earlier, and really good to see that work underway. And really good to hear some of the challenges being highlighted as well, of doing this work on the ground. It's easy to write documents that say do things. It's much more difficult to do them on the ground. So it's really good to hear from people who are involved in doing that. So to move on then, we're going to hear next from Aileen O'Sullivan. Aileen is an ecologist with Coillte, and she's been there since 1989. Her work in Coillte has spanned the broad range of ecological issues relevant to commercial forestry, from the perspectives of FSC and PEFC certification, and in relation to legislation such as the requirements of the Habitats Directive. Aileen holds a PhD from Trinity College. She undertook a study on the history of fire and native woodland vegetation development in Killarney National Park. Her studies focused on a 10,000-year history of oak wood development there from the post-glacial to the present day, and this has inspired her 30-year-long interest in forests and forest history. Prior to that, Aileen was a freelance ecologist, worked for the National Parks and Wildlife Service in a number of surveys for sites that later went on to become SACs, and she actually worked full-time for MPWS back in the day in relation to designation and woodland habitat conservation. Aileen believes passionately, I think, that forest conservation objectives can only be achieved by working closely with the forestry sector and with foresters in particular. And I'll ask Aileen now to make her presentation to us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Gerry, for inviting me to join you this morning and to have the opportunity to speak to you on such an important topic for all of us. By the way, I'm only with Coillte since 1999. In 1989, I was out having a very good time and not worrying about climate change and biodiversity crisis at all. But anyway, we'll let that go. So, right. I'd like to start by just looking back at where Coillte has come from, share with you a few lessons learned from that time, and then a look forward to a new strategy that is well underway and out for public consultation at the moment. So, it's kind of looking back, lessons learned, and looking forward. And Gerry, you can let me know if I'm running over time. So Coillte was set up in 1989 under legislation with a responsibility to manage the state forests, and at the time it was a primarily commercial mandate. I think the story of Coillte mirrors the story of a lot of companies and public bodies in Ireland, around the world. It was all about, getting the forestry sector up and running, getting a good commercial product, getting timber products out of the forest and up for sale, and managing all that in the most efficient way possible. Biodiversity and environment were there, but they were very much just kind of, to the side. And Coillte achieved an awful lot in that time, and we do have a vibrant forestry sector, and that's something we must be proud of, because we need foresters and we need a vibrant forestry sector as part of the solution to our future problems, to our current problems. So that was a success story, but in that time as well, we also developed a biodiversity programme. And probably the highlights, if I were to label them, were mapping biodiversity areas and features. So our habitats of particular ecological value are mapped. That's kind of an ongoing process, but we certainly hit it with a big bang in the early noughties, to the extent now where 90,000 hectares of the estate, which is about 20% of the estate, is mapped in that way. More recently, we developed BioClass as a way of ranking those habitats and translating their value, their conservation value, into the language of forestry, for foresters to understand what on earth I'm talking about, which is a big challenge. I'm sure Shirley will agree, communicating the message in a way that people can understand what it is we're talking about. And also implementing some major habitat restoration projects, starting in 2000 there with the People's Millennium Forests. You all have a certificate somewhere in your wardrobe or your cupboard somewhere giving you a share in those. That slide on the bottom there, probably one of my favourite sites on the whole of Coillte. Ballygannon, it's now 22 years old, that Millennium Forest, and it's well worth a visit there if any of you are ever in the neck of the woods of Rathdrum. Atty Slaney in the middle there, a beautiful piece of limestone pavement where conifers were removed. So those were the types of sites that were planted back in the day when they were trying to turn every scrap of land into a productive forest that would turn it to productive use. These sites were viewed as wastelands, let's not forget. That's where we've come from. So it was very easy to remove the conifers and just watch beautiful, natural vegetation spring up. And on the top there, a blanket bog, Derry in Mayo, which again was just halfway towards restoring itself, really. So they're the stories of the past. In terms of lessons learned, I just want to focus in on one particular property. It's a property called Drumalownert down in Kerry. It's also known in national park circles as Ballygasheen Bog. It was ranked very highly in the blanket bog surveys in 1989. And a chunk of that beautiful bog was in state ownership, in the ownership of Coillte, and a strip of that had been planted. I can't remember when, probably the 50s or 60s, 1950s, 60s. And you can see on the left-hand side there a slide where the strip of conifer forest is very clearly visible. Also in Coillte ownership, most of the property was never planted, and not many people know that Coillte owns some very high quality unplanted habitats as well, habitats that were never forested. So around 2003 or 4, the conifers were removed and the drains were blocked, and this was all done on an EU Life Nature project, of which we were really proud. There were 2,000 hectares of blanket bog treated in that way in that first Life project, and we were all high on life, and it was all marvellous. And the initial signs were of sphagnum, starting to recolonise in the drains, the vegetation springing back, and the water table coming right up to within 5 metres in some cases, certainly 10 metres of the peat surface, soon after the conifers had been removed. So that was all very encouraging. But at the time, we weren't thinking about carbon. Nobody really knew, the carbon side of things. But Ken Byrne in UCL, or UL, University of Limerick anyway, set up, I think it was one of the earliest carbon monitoring stations just beside that life site. And I suppose 20 years later, to my horror, I attended a conference organised by Shane Regan and Maurice Eakin. I think Catherine Farrell, you were very instrumental. Was it organised by you? I beg your pardon, Catherine. Well, I heard Shane Regan or somebody saying anyway that these restored bog was emitting carbon at the rate of knots, and I was crushed, I have to tell you. I thought, I think in those days we were just thinking about biodiversity, and we assumed that what was good for biodiversity was good for the planet. And it was quite hard to hear that story that our restored bogs are emitting carbon 20 years later. And that fact is now, it's quite widely accepted now. And there are models that show it can take 50 to 70 years for a bog that's been treated in that way to stabilise and become a carbon sink. So, 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to move on to the future. But anyway, the lesson learned is that these things are challenging, and I think it's been borne out in Eamon's talk as well as previous speakers, that the solutions aren't as simple as we might think. So what does that mean for us? Well, in Coillte we've gone back to do a lot of soul searching, and it's been prompted by just the change, the message. Coillte has been hearing the message that we've got to change the way we do things. It's very, very clear. And so we've done a lot of work. Coillte has been interacting with Project Woodland, which you'll have heard Minister Pippa Hackett talk about yesterday. We've done a deep dive, as they say, on the science, trying to unravel for carbon, for biodiversity, what is the science, what is it telling us, what are the big messages we need to understand in relation to the Coillte estate. On the wood side, it's all about timber production and sustainability, because trying to use timber increasingly to replace concrete and steel is also a very valid objective. And of course, people, the mental health benefits of forests and all of that. So it's a broad landscape, it's complex, but in each of those pillars, we've done our best to access the best available information. And pulling it all together into a strategy wasn't easy, but the strategy is there now with ambitious statements under each of those 4 pillars. It's available online. to consult, I would recommend you, the website is there, the address is there, but if you just Google Coillte consultation, it'll take you to current consultation on our strategic vision. And I'd encourage you to have a look and see what you think and you know, state your point of view. I suppose, I think I'm going to finish early, Gerry. In my experience, the lessons learned really are that we do our best, all of us, to take the right action, to listen to the science and to try and identify what is the best way we can really make a difference. I think now what we're being asked and challenged to do now as ecologists is open our minds wide open and engage maybe much more broadly than we would have done before, to consider options and solutions that don't look like what we would have considered to be habitat restoration. You know, I think the solutions are going to look much different when we factor in carbon, and Eamon mentioned it earlier. The solutions could look way different than what we think they might be. So we've got to be open to that. And I think to me, you know, the location phrase for us now is engage, engage, engage. We've got to engage with each other as ecologists, with different disciplines, with different skill sets, with foresters, with people who sell and market timber. It's got to be across the board, and we've got to listen to each other, respect each other's points of view, and try and work together to find the solutions that move the dial for us on these two important topics. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Aileen. That was really insightful. And again, I think it's really important that we hear from, you know, Coillte is a commercial company at the end of the day, and they have commercial objectives. They're established, you know, with those objectives, and it's really interesting to see their journey in, you know, moving from a particular focus to a much, much broader focus. And I think it's really interesting to hear practitioners talk to us about the challenges and, of course, the opportunities that doing this kind of work involves. So the idea with these 4 shorter talks was to bring you to different areas, to different aspects of the climate and biodiversity nexus. And so we next then move our focus to the coast and to the oceans. And I want to introduce you to Dr. Grace Cotter. Grace is an assistant professor in plant biology at University College Dublin and leader of the Blue Carbon Research Lab there. Her research focuses on quantifying carbon stocks and sequestration rates and greenhouse gas emissions from salt marsh habitats and coastal reed swamps, and assessing plant and habitat responses to climate change. In 2014, Grace undertook a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Centre in Maryland in the USA. And in 2020, she secured a Science Foundation Ireland Starting Investigator grant to launch blue carbon research in Ireland. So I think, as somebody mentioned earlier, one of our questioners, the ocean, the marine, the coastal ecosystem is really important. And so I'm delighted now to ask Grace to make her presentation to us.
Thanks very much, Gerry. And it's great to be here today. It's great to be in a real room and not on Zoom. So I'm going to highlight the importance, both for biodiversity and for climate, our coastal and marine habitats. And in particular, I'm going to focus on our coastal vegetated habitats, which are our salt marshes and our seagrasses. So in Ireland, we have approximately 100 kilometres squared of salt marsh habitat. And you can see here from this map that they're distributed right along the coast. They're classified according to their morphology or the nature of the substrate. So the morphology really meaning where on the coast they lie, whether they're in an estuary or next to sand dunes in a sand flat area. But, you know, what's obvious, I suppose, about this is that they're scattered right throughout the coast, and that actually makes it challenging for conservation and protection because they're all in these small pockets as such. But just to give you a visual on some of our salt marshes, so this is a peat salt marsh from County Donegal, and you can see here that the sea pink or the Armeria species is in flower. This is one taken in winter time from Barley Cove Salt Marsh in County Cork, and you can see here the channel that dissects the marsh, very, very distinctive feature of salt marshes. And then another one from the south, so from County Kerry, this is Derry Moor Salt Marsh. So this is an estuarine salt marsh, so it has that mud and some amount of sand as well in the substrate here. So these are our salt marshes. And then moving just quickly to our seagrasses, we have approximately 62 kilometres squared of seagrasses, and this is just what's actually mapped currently. Studies have predicted that it's actually probably much more than that. So through species distribution modelling, it's predicted that there's approximately 300 kilometres squared. So it breaks down then into about 45 kilometres squared of our Zostra marina. That's our subtidal seagrass species. And then we have approximately 17 kilometres squared of our dwarf eelgrass, the Zostra nalti. So this is the intertidal one. So that's, you know, it still is small amount geographically, but we do need to do a lot of work, particularly on our seagrasses, to actually get an accurate estimation of our extent. And then just briefly, this is our marine territory, which is made up of lots of different types of habitats, but the carbon-rich ecosystems in particular are macroalgae and some of our marine sediments as well. So you can see, you know, from this map, straight off how large our marine territory is, and there is that interest in figuring out how we can actually utilise and assess this area for carbon, for the carbon benefits, and so we can reach our climate targets. But just to getting back to biodiversity, so these habitats and our coastal vegetated habitats, our seagrasses and our salt marshes are really good for biodiversity. So our salt marshes, the ecosystem engineers are the plant species, the halophytes, and they kind of, you know, build the habitat and form the habitat. But in addition to that, these habitats, they're really good areas for juvenile fish and crustacean species. They provide an important habitat for bird species, and in Ireland in particular for overwintering brent geese, for little egrets, red shank oyster catchers, very important environment. And then moving to our seagrasses, so they really do support very high diversity of species such as brittle stars, anemones, jellyfish, amphipods. And just a note, here you can see that I have a bee in this picture, but there hasn't, as far as I know, been any work done on the capacity of salt marshes to support our pollinators. But just from my own observations and being out there in the summer, they can really be densely inhabited by bees foraging. So that's some work that could be done down the line. But just underpinning here that if you have a healthy ecosystem, so you have your biodiverse ecosystem that underpins the ecosystem function. So that's really, really important. So it can provide the ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, and therefore we get the climate benefit. So it's just that link between biodiversity and climate which is really important, and obviously what we want to point out today. So why are these habitats particularly important for climate, and particularly climate mitigation? Well, it's their capacity to sequester and store that CO2. So here we're focusing on salt marsh and seagrasses, and these habitats have been termed blue carbon habitats. Mangrove habitats are also under that category, but haven't mentioned them here as we obviously don't have them in Ireland. So they're specific to the tropics. So why they're so good is that the plants are photosynthesizing, they're drawing that CO2 down from the atmosphere, and that's getting stored long-term in the soils. And a key process within salt marshes and seagrass beds is in that sediments, there's very, very little oxygen. So they're quite anoxic, and that allows for the carbon to build up. It doesn't decompose easily. So that's a really, really key point. So on a per area basis, these habitats are very efficient at storing that carbon, and this graph really shows that. So it's a comparison here with tropical forests. And again, I just point out the fact that this is in tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare. So it's on a per hectare basis. Even globally, we have far less coastal wetlands than we have tropical forests. But on a per area basis, when you break it down to just, let's say, a metre squared of salt marsh habitat or a metre squared of tropical forests, it's the salt marsh habitats that are more efficient at storing that carbon, and that all comes down to the processes going on in the soil and those anoxic conditions, essentially. And that's very similar to peatland as well. But what happens if we degrade these habitats? So this is really, really key in climate mitigation as well, because we need to protect them and conserve them so that we don't allow them to be a carbon source. So if you take away, the biodiversity, that ecosystem function, you reduce the plant biomass. If you degrade it through draining or impounding in a salt marsh, in seagrass beds, it can often be poor water quality, which affects the biodiversity. Then you reduce its ability to actually sequester carbon, and that degradation enables it to be a carbon source. So that's a key point here, that not only, if you degrade the habitat, not only do you stop it being a carbon sink, but you create a carbon source. So that's very, very important. And just briefly on our other blue carbon ecosystems, our macroalgae and deep sea sediments, which I just note that they're quite important, but they're a little bit trickier to quantify. So we know that in a salt marsh or a seagrass, the carbon gets sequestered in situ, so in the habitat. But with our kind of broader marine habitats, we find, it is the case that the carbon can get transferred. So for instance, if you take this diagram here, you have kelp growing, which is drawing down loads and loads of CO2 from the water column, but it's not getting sequestered right there in the kelp bed. It's getting decomposed, it's getting taken out to sea, and then some amount of it, usually between 4 and 10%, actually gets sequestered then in marine sediments at an area further out to sea. So that is more complicated, and the science underpinning that is sort of ongoing at the moment. So there still are a lot of uncertainties in terms of the figures surrounding that. But despite being protected under the EU Habitats Directive, our salt marshes, our seagrasses, despite that, there still are, degradation is still taking place. And so this is from the two most recent habitat assessment reports. And so why is that the case? So they're being impacted by land reclamation, by impoundment, that's in particular our salt marsh habitats, and then our seagrass habitats are being impacted by poor water quality, invasive species, and also dredging. And invasive species is an interesting one in that, by and large, it will have a negative effect, but there are some cases where an invasive species has had a positive effect on carbon. So that's something for managers to be aware of, where there can be a kind of a difference in management there. But just getting to the actions now again, so we do need further protection measures for biodiversity, and we do need to understand the key management for carbon benefits as well. And so when we'll be rolling out marine protected areas, we need to understand where are the biodiversity hotspots, but also where are those carbon hotspots, and to understand how they're both interlinked in those areas, and to increase then that protection around them. So the research is underway here in Ireland now, both in salt marshes, seagrass beds, and also the wider marine habitats as well. But what we need to do as researchers is to ensure that we're working across sector, that we're not just out in the field getting the data and then hoping for the best. We need to be working with stakeholders, we need to be working across the governmental departments as well, so we can turn that data and that knowledge into management and into policy. So we also need to raise public awareness of the importance of these habitats, and certainly in terms of salt marshes, there are groups like Coastwatch Europe, which is doing a really good job of raising the public awareness of seagrass beds. But alongside that, so it's moved quickly in terms of carbon finance for these habitats, but what we need to do as well is to work to ensure that we can actually get finance for some of those co-benefits, so environmental credits as such, so for the amount of biodiversity you can protect, for coastal protection, and for other services that the actual habitats provide. So that's going to be really important moving forward to try and do those in tandem, to work on the carbon finance credits, but also the environmental credits as well. And so just to thank the funders, so SFI, the Marine Institute and the EPA, so they're the current funders of this carbon research in Ireland. Gurf Magwith.
Thanks very much, Grace, for that really informative view of our coasts and of our marine. And sometimes I think, as somebody pointed out perhaps earlier, that we sometimes are very focused on land and we forget our coasts and our marine area. So I know we haven't, we started our session later than we did because of the visit of An Taoiseach, and he was very keen, I know, to speak to as many delegates as possible. So we started a little bit late, but we are pretty much on time, and we will probably run a little bit into the coffee break with your indulgence, but I will ensure that you get some coffee before. I know we're starting another set of sessions at 20 to 12. Just to say that now. Before we go on to our last presentation, and I want to introduce Maryann Harris. Maryann is a landscape architect and environmental scientist with a specialism in environmental assessment and law. She's a senior executive and lead on nature-based solutions in the Dublin Metropolitan Climate Action Regional Office, perhaps known to you as the CARO. She previously managed biodiversity for Dublin City Council and is a former chair of the Urban Forum and a past president of the Irish Landscape Institute. She has degrees from Cornell University in the US and from Trinity College here in Dublin, and recently completed studies as an EPA fellow for a doctorate with UCD. So I'm delighted now Mary is going to talk to us about nature-based solutions in urban environments. Maryann, please come and make your presentation.
Thanks, Gerry, and thanks to everybody for hanging on with the late running of the schedule. I was just thinking about 1989, and I was in Cornell University in ecology lectures learning about this thing called climate change that was starting to become an issue, and how we were going to have to try to develop models and figure out what it would mean for us in the future. So that was my year of starting to get an introduction to the topic. So I'm going to talk to you about nature-based solutions in urban environments as responses to climate and biodiversity challenges, and I'm going to probably pick up, I think, on a few of the previous speakers' topics in that. So if we can, there. Just for those of you who don't know about the CAROs, there are 4 CARO offices nationwide, and they're on a regional basis. They were established in 2018 under the National Adaptation Framework, and our role is to coordinate and support local government to lead by example and to drive climate action locally. We have a governance structure, and we're funded by Gerry's department. So just a brief overview there. In terms of nature-based solutions, there are a few different definitions floating around, but I have given you the one from the IUCN, and these are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So it's an interesting definition because it includes very urban, very modified ecosystems. It's not just restrictive to more natural, undisturbed areas. And also, it's linking human well-being into biodiversity. So what can nature-based solutions provide for us? So I've just tried to give you a list of some of the key benefits. And I think some of the previous speakers have also given you good examples of those benefits. We might also refer to them as ecosystem services. And you can see that climate change adaptation is one of the key things that nature-based solutions can provide, as well as conserve and restore biodiversity in ecosystems. And we talked a little bit about flooding, water quality, temperature, carbon sequestration. They can also prevent erosion and also help to filter pollutants from both air and water, so that can have direct and indirect benefits for biodiversity. Now, under the new National Biodiversity Action Plan, from what we've been circulated with for this conference, you will see Objective 4 is to embed biodiversity at the heart of climate action. And within that objective, that the government have included nature-based solutions as a fundamental part of action for climate and biodiversity. Now, it was referred to yesterday as the bill. It's actually an act since December. That's the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act 2021. And the National Climate Objective links biodiversity legally into climate action. So, you know, this idea that you're going to address climate change and take action for the climate maybe without regard for biodiversity, whereas that has been in the case in the past where certain measures maybe didn't regard biodiversity, that would not be in line any longer with the National Climate Objective. It interlinks climate resilience with biodiversity-rich environments. And within this, we can view nature-based solutions as a key measure for win-win solutions for both. Now, within the Dublin region, for Carrow, my region, we have 4 local authorities, and they each have their own climate action plans. Each one is unique to its own functional area. But the interesting thing was that these were developed in a unified approach across the Dublin region on a regional basis. So we didn't have each county totally doing their own thing. You know, it was done in harmony and with a lot of overlapping actions that are transboundary, because as people have been saying, biodiversity doesn't recognize boundaries, nor does climate change impacts. So under the new Act, the 2021 Act, there will be a process that the Minister will be calling on the local authorities to review their plans, because many local authorities around the country have climate adaptation plans. I think Shirley touched on this with you. So some of them do not include mitigation. So under the new system, we're going to see more like what was done in Dublin, these climate action plans that include adaptation and mitigation. But I wanted to point out to you as a model that you might want to look at, that nature-based solutions is one of the 5 key areas in these plans. And those of you who are very active in the biodiversity community action side of things, you know, providing submissions on the climate action plans would be a very useful thing to consider in terms of how to influence the shape of these new plans, and the process of plan making should include the biodiversity sector, particularly with nature-based solutions. So I would encourage you to read those and consider them when they're up for review. I've just given you a quick report card there on the nature-based solutions actions in the current climate action plans for Dublin. So as you can see, there are quite a number of nature-based solutions actions in each of the plans by each local authority. These figures are the 2021 progress reports, with apologies to South Dublin. I only have the 2020 for them, but I'm sure we're close on target. So what you can see is similar to what was discussed yesterday in one of the sessions about the Biodiversity Action Plan nationally. A lot of them are ongoing actions, and that's perhaps maybe in part to the way the actions are actually written, that they're these kind of multi-year ongoing actions. So there's not as many complete, and there's less completion of nature-based solutions within the 5 key themes of the climate action plan. So for example, versus transport. But I think part of that as well is, you know, you have these discrete projects under things like transport, and they have a start and an end date, whereas the biodiversity ones tend to run, or the nature-based solutions tend to run over multi-annual programs. But it's just something to point out. And so in terms of some of the typical actions, I'm going to just fly through. You can read these later, and they'll be available to people. You can see that things like local authority tree strategies have been developed, and new standards for the development plans. And there's been intensive effort on county hedgerow surveys, because while we talk about planting new trees for carbon sinks, it's really crucial that we retain existing trees, because it's going to take about 30 years before the new ones will really prove effective in that regard. And land use change is a major threat in the Dublin area, you know. So in terms of carbon sinks, I have also included salt marshes in there. So one of the prime salt marshes in Ireland is Dublin Bay. And there's been extensive work with different universities. They're doing surveys of the salt marsh, the algae, and the coastline itself by the GSI. The first overall LIDAR survey has been completed now for Dublin Bay. That's a huge baseline for climate change monitoring. I would have to do one for everybody in the audience. All 4 local authorities are doing different projects on rewetting, constructing different wetlands, beach restoration projects. There's the CCAP project, which Fingal and UCD have been working on, which has been a lot of community engagement in it. But this is a big space in Dublin that people have been working on for a number of years, trying to restore and construct wetlands. Through our colleagues in Carrow Atlantic Seaboard North, a sand dune conservation network was established last year. And this is an area where we can bring together climate action and biodiversity action in particular to highlight to people the importance of their dunes, to protect their coastline, and of course for the species and habitats that are perhaps most vulnerable to climate change. So this year we have events planned for World Sand Dune Day, and we're also doing there, you see, in Portmarnock Beach with the local tidy towns and Antashka and Fingal County Council, Carrow doing work with them on replanting and restoring marram grass habitat. And we have tools and communication packs now developed for local authorities, which you could have a look at if you're interested in. In terms of policy in Dublin, sustainable urban drainage systems have been established in Dublin and been worked on, but now we actually have policy, and this is integrated now into the county development plans. So what these are systems to control stormwater quality and quantity, so they can aid both biodiversity and dealing with climate change impacts. We have new national guidance, and now we have also more detailed county guidance. So we have a macro and a more local level specific actions, and different programs to provide wildlife habitats. So these policies were originally started in 2005 in the Greater Dublin Strategic Drainage Study, which I've just given you the acronym for. So that has been on the cards, but now we're actually seeing the results of that in terms of practical projects. Soil sealing is another major issue for the Dublin region because we have a higher than EU average amount of it compared to other EU cities. And this results in increased stormwater runoff to natural watercourses, and that's going to be exacerbated through climate change and more frequent and intense storms. So Dublin Carrow and the GSI and UCD are mapping soil sealing in Dublin now, and that, in alignment with those policies I just mentioned for SUDS, should help us to convert paved areas. And this could even be for providing soil for pollinators. Even bare soil has a value, and also under the urban greening strategies. So it was mentioned yesterday about the EU biodiversity strategy, and there are specific objectives for urban greening plans to be prepared by all EU member states. So within the Dublin Carrow region, the local authorities are preparing and implementing urban greening strategies. And I've given you a list of them from all the different 4 Dublin local authorities there. And within Dublin City, there's been a focus on the area between the canals, which also goes back to that soil sealing area that I showed you. In Dunleary, they've been working on pilot projects to convert brownfield to greenfield, and they have a slow to mow policy. Fingal have their own seed kits for home gardens and initiatives with local tidy towns, and South Dublin have put a huge emphasis on converting areas to urban wildflower meadows. So those are just some examples of the urban greening projects under the EU biodiversity strategy and the climate action plans. One of the other big challenges for the Dublin Carrow region is urban pluvial flooding and urban heat island effects. So heat island effects result from increased temperatures, and they affect quality of life, but they also increase energy costs for buildings, which again drives more issues with emissions. So these feedback loops that we talked about. So now Dunleary and Dublin City Council have prepared green and blue roof guides under their current climate action plans. We do need more, however, biodiversity on these roofs. We tend to have mainly just sedum roofs. We need more compliance with conditions that are given under planning permissions. And we need to get more baseline for Dublin on how these would actually impact on urban flooding. And catchment level impacts that they could have. So we can focus on where green roofs are most effective to construct, and that we're conditioning them in the right areas of the city to have rapid change, because we need urgent action. Cara are doing a pilot green roof project with UCD, the Irish Green Building Council, Dún Laoghaire Rathdown, and Fingal County Council. And this is to measure the ability of green roofs in Dublin to control further urban heat island effect, i.e. to promote transpiration and to slow stormwater runoff. So we now have selected the sites and we have the funding in place, and the work will be starting this summer. That will give us for the first time baseline for Dublin on a range of different sites, both inner city, coastal and suburban as well. And that will help us to calculate and model what could be done if we can scale that up on a catchment level. Just to finish on the point that I want to make, which was for all of these projects, nature-based solutions have a really important aspect in that it's one of the ways that we can engage with citizens and involve a wider range of people. So when you look at climate action plans, you have actions for transport and energy, but those are specific sectors, and those are specific government agencies that tend to do those and implement them. Whereas nature-based solutions, actions, have potential to make meaningful change in people's lives, to change behavior of people, and to increase their awareness of nature, biodiversity, and climate change. So within those climate action plans, having nature-based solutions that we're implementing will have much more wider ripple effects as well. And that could only be good as well for biodiversity action. And just to finish, Dublin Bay has a UNESCO biosphere, and they are global sites for demonstration of climate action and for testing of ideas and implementation of nature-based solutions. So the biosphere within the Dublin-Cara region is a test bed for this, and is also an area where we can link to international networks and learn and also show what we are doing. And I won't go through all those. I've just given you kind of my list or my thoughts on the advantages and the challenges of urban nature-based solutions. And I would be interested in people's thoughts on that as well in the room, and your own experience on that. We could talk about that for the whole session, so I won't. Just to say there are some structural issues, I think, that need to be looked at if we're going to try and get nature-based solutions adopted more widely. Thank you very much. And if you would please sign up for our newsletter, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Maryann. Really important to hear about the application of nature-based solutions in cities. And, you know, when you look worldwide, more than half of the global population now lives in cities. So what cities do is really important, and I think it is great to have that perspective. So we've had 4 perspectives now, following on from Eamon's overview at the beginning. I'd like to ask Eamon now to join us on the stage. And now it's over to you. We have time for some questions or contributions from the floor. So again, I just ask you to put up your hand and somebody will go to you with a microphone, hopefully, and we can take a few minutes. And I do promise you I will have you out for coffee while there's still some coffee to be had. So maybe this gentleman here, or if we can...
Fintan Kelly with the Irish Environmental Network. So I'd like to thank all the panellists. Really interesting and engaging presentations. And as someone that works in the NGO sector, I particularly appreciated the recommendations. I think it would support the vast majority of them, which is excellent to see. My question is for Aileen O'Sullivan. So I think it's clear from the majority of the presentations that peatland restoration is an essential action looking forward to respond to the biodiversity and climate crisis. We know that Coillte is the largest peat owner in the Irish state, over 230,000 hectares. We know that 60% of state forestry is on peat and deep peats. There was very clear, I suppose, targets for afforestation in your presentation. So my question is, does Coillte have clear targets for peat to forest to peat restoration? And if not, why is that the case?
Is this working? Yeah. Thank you for your query. I didn't actually talk about afforestation at all, but all I can talk about is the management of the Coillte estate, as you know, the current forest estate, if you like. We do have targets, But I suppose the point, we do have targets, and they're in that strategy that there's 30,000 hectares. I don't want to go into numbers here because there are a lot of numbers in that strategy. I would encourage you to go and engage with it and read it. And there's a portal where you can ask questions if it's not clear. There's an ambitious strategy, but not all. We're not going to. What you won't see in the strategy is every hectare of peat is going to be restored on the Coillte estate, because the science of carbon doesn't point to that. So this is the point I was trying to make to you, that assumptions that we made as ecologists of what was best for the planet aren't borne out when the science of carbon is brought into the picture. It's not as simple as that. Restoring afforested peatlands won't deliver the results we think we once thought maybe it would have. So the picture is not as clear cut. So what we've done is an analysis balancing the productivity of the forest and the nature of the soil, and the balance between those two is critical in determining the carbon balance or the carbon budget. I don't know, Eamon would have much better language around that than I have. So we will be targeting the peatlands where we believe the situation points towards the need for rehabilitation or restoration. But even within that space, it's not entirely clear. You can see there are clear peatland, forests on peatland systems. You saw it on my slide in Drummalonard there, where the forest is clearly a part of a hydrological unit on a very deep peat. They're what I call the no-brainer sites for restoration. But there are many other forests that are on very different types of peats, and the case for restoration is not so clear. And we're not quite sure what is the best thing to do with those forests. We're open to ideas. It could be some form of rewilding. It could be some form of maintaining some kind of forest cover, but a type of forest cover that will look completely different. But the carbon part, the carbon science is forcing us to go back and look again at what is the best thing we can do with our peatland resource. And I'm very, keen to hear from people who have the knowledge, better knowledge certainly than I have. And I think that's the point about engagement, being open to those very different options.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll take one more from the floor, and then I'm keen to take one from online as well. So maybe if somebody might give my colleague Kelly a microphone while we're taking this next question, that'd be great. Thank you.
Gerry, will I go for a question then? It's Siobhan from the Environmental Protection Agency. Is that okay? Here I am.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. My question for the panel is, how do we avoid running to stand still? So just given the context that Eamon provided and his work and the challenge that's ahead of us, is there one transformative thing in each of your areas that you'd like to see happen that could make a very significant difference? And I say transformative because that's what the CBD, Elizabeth, and what Anna Maria from the IPBES reports that they presented yesterday, that's what they were calling for. That's what the challenge is. What's the transformative change? So would you have one thing to suggest? Thank you.
I think I'll ask Eamon maybe just to answer this. I'm kind of reluctant to ask everybody because I'm keen to take another question and one from the floor. Our speakers will be here all day, so please, nobble them at coffee and have these conversations. But maybe if I could ask Eamon just to respond to that, please.
Yeah, it's not the answer you want, but we need to do everything, is my answer. So we need to do afforestation sustainably. We need to restore peatlands where appropriate sustainably. I'm speaking from the climate perspective primarily, but the further challenge is we need then to make sure that we do so in a way that biodiversity is protected and enhanced where possible as well. So if we don't do all of those things, we haven't got a hope of reaching some sort of stability or net zero in our land system. I know that's fairly clear. So it's a really transformative change, I think, in terms of land use in Ireland that we're going to be looking towards if we're going to achieve those goals. And it's not going to be easy, but there are definitely win-wins. I think lots of the examples we've seen from the rest of the panel is very encouraging to see that that's possible. But this has come up yesterday as well, I think, in the other sessions, the need the right action in the right place. And I guess with the the afforested peatland areas, site specifics are going to be really important. So I'm not sure that's the direct answer to the question you wanted, but I think we need everything, and we need to act rapidly as well and learn as we go and collect data as we go. I think we don't have time to wait now for the best available data on everything. We have to actually act, and some things we do may not work as we wish, but we'll be able to hopefully gather that data as we go, improve, and then we can gain some momentum, hopefully.
Can I
Shirley is very anxious
Can I answer that, if you don't mind, just from my perspective? I find that, I've spent since 2006 trying to get work done on peatlands in Monaghan. And it takes ages to gather the evidence base, and then you're trying to work through tons of policies, and you could produce policies till you're blue in the face, and still we have very few results to actually show for it, you know what I mean? And I completely agree with Siobhan in that we could be running to stand still. So we can look like we're really busy, but we're not actually achieving anything, and our targets aren't being reached. And I would say, look to see where environmental trends have changed. And for me, the only place that I can see really environmental trends have changed are where the results-based payment schemes are being implemented. There are where you can see environmental trends for water and habitat quality or whatever going the other direction. They're going up. So the key to those schemes are that they're local, so you're working on nature locally, and that's much more tangible than trying to figure out your contribution to emissions globally. If you're working on climate and nature locally based in your place with landowners, they're flexible because they're looking at the results. So what you're doing is you're saying we must achieve these results, but you're flexible into what actions you take to meet those results. So when you're flexible as to what actions you can take, you're given autonomy. You're working with your peers, and you're given autonomy as to what you can do. So you're in control. So much like culture and engagement with your place gives you that rooted sense of security to how you can actually deliver for climate without getting overly anxious. That actual as well choice in how you achieve what the results are. I think that's where we really need to go. And I think that those learnings are there, and that would be something that I would say would be quite transformative, Siobhan.
Okay, I think I'm really anxious that we take a question from our online participants. So, Kelly, if you have a question there, please.
How can the urgency of actions be conveyed to policy systems in ways that can lead to concrete actions, bearing in mind the complexity of the relationship between biodiversity and climate?
Okay, so I think just to repeat that, how can we communicate with the policy system, which is kind of complicated, and the need for urgent action, and very much like the previous question. So maybe ask a couple of our contributors who haven't, Maryann or Grace, if you want to contribute to this, please.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, I think, and this gets back to the earlier point as well, is that for the action to take place, it is engaging in the local communities first and foremost. And it's the same for salt marsh restoration and seagrass restoration as well. And there have been successes internationally with mangrove restoration. And again, when there's been payment, so when it's been through carbon finance, so they can actually sell those carbon credits back to the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets. And so there has been successes. There are also some difficulties in terms of if the local communities aren't engaged enough, and that has happened with big multinationals coming into and trying to restore large areas of mangrove in places in Africa and so on. But if the local communities are engaged from the get-go, then these are seem to be much more successful on many different levels. So I think that engagement, first of all, with the local communities is sort of that real action base and that grassroots, and that's where the successes are going to be. And that's where the restoration, really the heart of the restoration, can take place. So I think that's, just in terms of action, that's a key point.
Maryann, 30 seconds, please.
We need to move, in the climate action plans, we included our actions, but we also had some actions awaiting funding. So how do we get that urgency and move them across the aisle? We need to find resources for those actions. One of them was actually salt marsh restoration for Dublin. So we need to actually probably get more people in critical roles at local government level. It was great to see 43 people appointed in Dublin City Council recently under active travel, but we need a green army for nature-based solutions as well, I'm afraid. And we definitely need to, in the next round of plans, try and cost these actions and have very clear timeframes. We can't keep having things rolling, oh, sometime over the next 5 years we'll do it. We're going to have to be more definite.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm going to have to draw our discussion, our really interesting discussion of the links between biodiversity and climate to a close. It just remains for me to thank you all for coming, and I'd really like you to show your appreciation for our speakers, please. I think for me, if I was to take away one thing from the entire of this morning, I think it would be global challenges, yes, but local solutions delivered with and for local people. I think that is the real takeaway message here this morning. So thank you very much. Hope you can get a cup of coffee and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.